Quiero agradecerles su presencia con nosotros hoy y reconocer que estamos situados en las tierras ancestrales de naciones tribales, incluyendo el Massachusetts y el Wampanoag. También quiero agradecer a los grupos patronizados en Boston College de este evento. Incluyen el programa de estudios medioambientales, el Departamento de Biología, el Instituto Schiller de Ciencia y Sociedad Integradas y el programa de Psicología Aplicada del Desarrollo y de Educación de la Escuela Lynch. También es muy importante presentarles a Claudio Ruiz de California, Texas y ahora Boston y sus alrededores. Él estará ayudándonos hoy como intérprete bilingüe.
So we're gonna talk about the two panelists. Belkis Izquierdo Flores is an indigenous lawyer of the Columbia National University with a doctorship in government and public policy of the public administration public school. She's also a lawyer and the determination and conducts. And she's also coordinator of the ethnic and racial panel in Colombia. Sorry. She's also the consultant at the National United Nations program for different public entities and private entities in Colombia. It's a great honor to give you our welcome here this morning. This is Bian. This is an anthropologist with a degree in laws from the Carlos Tres Madrid University in Madrid. She's an investigator of the Human Rights Project Beyond the Human project. This project is financed by the European Council of Investigation of the European Commission. She also works as a commissioner. For 15 years, she has collaborated with the Indonesian group in Ecuador, Colombia, Guatemala, and Peru, and things related to transitional justice, human rights, and to cultural human rights, pluralistic jurisprudence, and rights of the indigenous people. Thank you both for being here. Thank you very much. From the land of Santa Marta, Colombia, I want to send you a harmonious welcome for everyone being present, participating in this dialogue. It is a dialogue from of, an opportunity to get into know, because it's a great opportunity to share uh, thoughts, knowledge, and experiences. We know that our time is very limited here, but it's very important that that wherever you're connecting from, that we ourselves the ability to think positively, to think constructively on how to create peace, how to create new visions, because the world is as it is, diverse. But there's always something that we have in common, which is our world, our bigger home. Is it possible that you can put the presentation for me, please? Or can I share it myself? Can I screen share myself from here? Just Belkis, please go ahead and share it yourself. Is it working? Great. Very well. Thank you. Well, Brenton, thank you for the invitation for inviting me to your university. This dialogue, we want to have it within the justice and reparation framework for multiple systems of life. And we call it such because nowadays it's necessary not just to think in ourselves as human beings, but to start thinking of the relationships in the interdependent relationships that we have with all the different the diverse systems of life. They also have the right to live and to thrive. So in my ability as a judge, I want to say that the special jurisdiction for peace, it is something that is part of a system. It's an integral part of the commission of a clarification and the tribunal that is in charge of to investigate the violations of human rights and that happened within the armed conflict in Colombia before 2016. So here's the mandate that we're trying to take care of. It is it's also important to point out that this tribunal, tribunal, so so this is a space where we're seeking. Then everything says that that's just a conflictive dialogue, but it's something try to create a productive dialogue that takes us towards a better future. So that's why I point out that the function of this body that I'm part of, they, they let us know about the patterns of microcriminality that contributed to we have seen said is centrality of the victims. And in order to acknowledge the voice of the victims is what part of this what this tribunal is trying to do, is trying to find out the truth of what happened and to provide justice to the victims. So we have paused to stop and think and rethink about, are we talking about a specific a truth? Are we talking about historic truth, a judicial truth, an exhaustive and detailed truth, or is it a truth that contributes to the liberation of the conscience, both of victims and the victimizers? Because within a process that seeks a, 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 a better outcome, and this is the only thing that allows you to create a great reconciliations within Colombia. So we're creating patterns of microcriminality, and this is based on the more representative crimes that occurred during that period, where the communities, the people, the farmers, and everyone within the territories where the conflict took place, and try to go through all those grave incidents that took place, but also very important to what's happening nowadays as well. So we're trying to identify the main people responsible for that, but also everyone else that was a part of the micro criminality aspect of things. Now, that being said, I want to let you know that it has been a huge challenge for the jurist, the indigenous jurist in this commission. For me, in my condition as a judge, I want to share with you the responsibility and the importance of what like the land is for the indigenous people and for all this ethnic minorities within these places. So that's one mention that we have created the accredited territories as another victim of the conflict. So what is the point of designing the territory as a victim as well? Well, what we try to comprehend, and by that I mean when you understand what you're thinking with your heart, with your reasoning, but also with what you do, that the land is alive, and the land was an integral part of the conflict. So that's why it's necessary that to consider it as a live subject, as a live victim of, and to acknowledge all the damages that were done to the land during this period. And that is why we are trying to work towards creating, to let to, to give a narrative of how what happened to the territory with this conflict, and also to make clear who can talk about this territory, that is the ancestral indigenous land. So we believe that those ancestral peoples are the ones better suited to talk about this, because they're the ones better suited because of the connection to the land. And when we mention that the land is a live entity, well, it's people as part of that entity, and as such, they are assigned the voice to this land. And this is the only way you can present all the cultural, spiritual, and physical aspects of this territory. Now, when we design the territory as a victim, that implies that it has certain rights. So it becomes a subject of the legal system. So as a victim in the armed conflict, it should be given all the things that will be, that will befit him, and also to see how they can be how justice can be brought back to it. So as such, also it has to have a judicial representative within the frame of all this process. So, so as such, the voice of the territory must be present in this conversation, also within the framework of what in Colombia we have called, we mentioned the judicial framework. The Article 146 of the Special Commission, and the seventh article when it comes to recognizing the intercultural diversity of indigenous people. That's what allows us to recognize what we already said. It's like it recognizes the justice systems themselves, because it's only there where we the the uh, the judicial framework is is the one where it can be present in this dialogue, because of its relationship in the novel relationship that it has between the native peoples with that land. Now I want to share this graph, this image, which is an exercise in reflection, when we're talking about how the nature is being destroyed, and some people call it uh, the environment. I don't know. I have a questions about that uh, comment. But for within the framework, what we're trying to do, we call it just the environment. Just to, so anyway, we're trying to talk about the logic of thinking and practice. Sometimes we talk about it as an abstraction, but within the indigenous people, it's a more seamless transition between one and the other when it comes to how we put it in practice. Because sometimes it's very easy to just talk and talk and talk, but when it comes to the practice, it's not quite the same. So I'm trying to place it here as like the logic of thinking and practice, with that is within the Western concept of think of the individualism. Uh, it sometimes clashes with collectivism and indigenous people. So in order to be able to explain things, sometimes we try to a great effort culturally to try to explain it, but sometimes we go so far into the individualistic concept of thinking of the Western world that you end up leaving aside all the richness and the diversity of the collective thinking that indigenous people practice in a collective manner. So I wanted to explain this thing because it tells where what is our starting point. In my position as a indigenous jurist in this commission for the peace, when the other magistrates are very diverse, where there's at, where there's Afro-Colombian and indigenous people being part of this, we try to develop the focus of the ethnic and racial framework. So we try to put one foot in the logical side of things, and the other one we're trying to put our foot and under the framework we're trying to create a more diverse and moral society. Unfortunately, there's so much systemic discrimination. So that's where many times the traditional indigenous way of thinking clashes with the Western concept of how to do things. When we're talking about the nation, we talk about collective thinking when it comes to natural things. Well, the individual, that's so important in the Western concept, is part of this other thing, is both part of the territory and of the collective. It cannot be separated one from the other. So when we do that, we find an omnidirectional framework of the, like when it comes to property rights and all the other things. We have a framework thinking that has many things in part. It's the land, it's the environment, it's the culture, and it's everything else. Where like one individual is not better than the other one, has more rights than the others, but we see it as a collective. So another thing that I wanted to share with you is that recognizing this territory as a victim, the idea is to achieve that within our logical thinking, try to understand the indigenous logic and start from their own vision, so we're able to understand the importance and their in inseparable connection that the indigenous people have with the land. So we feel it's important to repair that to make it healthier, so we can also, as Western folks, achieve a healthy outcome for ourselves. So sometimes we don't have to be in one or the other, but perhaps to create a third column where both things can coexist together. I want to now share visions and practice of the land for the indigenous people Awa and Ihuarhoka. So which are commonly known as Awako. Now that name came out in the Santa Marta Sierra. So they did a lot of Wacos or Warquerias, and that's how they ended up with that name. So, but we call ourselves Pintua. So now the land is understood. So all the lands is more than anything else. It's more beyond the borders. The land is palpable. It's what can be seen, grab, farm. We can have our home. We can farm. This is the land. That is the land. That's what people say. What the Western world called private property and natural resources doesn't exist among us. For us, Awa, all the beings and things in nature as are an integral part of the same thing, and they all belong to each other. So that's what they teach us since they're very, very little, that the first sacred land is the body, and that body is completely interconnected with the greater land. Now, like the present in the territory of humans, animals, and plants, as well as the spirits that protects us under certain laws and punishment, that's the one that creates the conditions for humans to decide whether exploitation of the what of what the Occidental folks called resources. It's why that it's important to talk about the territory, uh, the indigenous our land, the way they see it as an integral single entity. For them, the land is a living creature, and that's why that's and that's what we call the love of origin. That the land has its own identity, so we're trying to reinforce those feelings and to bring them back, which means that a people without their own integral sacred land is basically stripped from result of its own identity, and as people they disappear. So we had to so we ask we stop thinking that the land as a fraction thing, but recognize it as an individual, as you will see any other individual in the Western world. So we need to understand in a more integral way how life itself of the human being depends of that relationship with everything else that's alive, and we need to upkeep that in order to stay alive, and all that becomes and like being a guardian for everything that's alive and existing. So the territory as a whole entity where the living and non-living things have equal rights, where life grows and dies, is the most important thing to uphold, and the one thing most important thing that governs is only through the land that you create logic and relationships between different societies, in between different living individuals with different systems of lives that also have the same right of life as one does. So I wanted to share that within like a logic and practice on how the Arhuaco people to the north and south of this place in Nariño, and to the south is the Agua people. I'm sorry. Now, but now in closing, I want to reiterate the importance that is to understand the relationships between the living territory. We're talking about an indivisible relationship, but always within the posture or a thought where created by an integral logic where the where everything complement each other, and based on those two frames of thinking, that's where we try to interact with the Western way of thinking. So I want to reiterate the importance that for you to support us to continue with our work, because the thinking of many native peoples in Latin America, we call ourselves guardians of life, guardians for conserving the big house, which is Pachamama, or the motherland. And well, I don't want to overextend myself too much. I want to thank you for your patience and your interest. Thank you very much. Well, we're gonna listen now to the select, and then we're gonna go to the Q&A. Voy a tratar, va- vamos a cambiar a lenguaje. We're going to switch to Spanish. So I wanted to thank the Boston College Center to open our doors for this encounter uh, about the legal things that are taking place, not just in Colombia, but also throughout the whole region, Latin America, uh, recognizing a territory as victim of the armed conflicts. Okay, I'm sure that generates many questions, and this, especially for legal people as well as academics, because at the beginning, the territory, as our colleague mentioned it, from the Occidental point of view, it's not a live entity, and property is just property, and property for them it just doesn't exist. So I'm also very thankful that we can hear directly uh, Belkis' voice directly from Colombia, because unfortunately, it's not very common that academia open the door indigenous scholars, even within this concept. In fact, there was a small uh, uh, controversy in Colombia because there was an event that was organized to talk about the great advance in the several things, including cultural diversity. So there was critical between the Afro and indigenous communities because the dialogue was not diverse at all. They didn't consider the participation of indigenous or Afro-Colombian participants or presenters. They recognized the gray area in a very public manner, and I think that at the very end, they did invited some non-mestizo, non-white panelists. But this controversy reminds us the huge responsibility that we have as people of the academia to fight within our own, events, this historic wrong. So now I take advantage in this space to point it out, and that's why I'm very happy that en la última edición de nuestra publicación dedicated the whole introduction to the theme of racism within academia, because up to this day, institutional racism and systemic racism is a huge existing reality around the world. So this thing that that our colleagues shared just before me, it gives us a lot of hope for on behalf of the indigenous people, try to advance a new better process. So my question was a bit to the what can we do within the seminary. So 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 I decided to share some thoughts on the work I did in Guatemala with indigenous survivors, with the genocide that took place there. And also, it's something that Belkis and I are writing together. It's an analysis of what we've been doing. And let me see if I can find the article that we're working on. What is the legal impossibility? See, which means that they live in territory as an entity, and also a victim of armed conflict. So we're gonna express some profound reflection on this, and why it has up until now impossible to recognize that the land itself is a living entity. So I just share a little bit what the work that the collaborative work that we've been doing for the last few years, because I'm very happy to see the participation people around the world being part of this. We have done all the seminars in Spanish, all in Spanish so far, but everything is available within our webpage. And we have a publication that is actually in English that we talk about all this work. So this is another step towards the work that we're trying to create. And this accreditation, as we call it in our legal jargon, this generates a lot of questions, and we're not going to be able to answer every single one of them in this space, obviously, but my colleague mentioned a few of them, like the territory as a non-human victim of the conflict. What are the difference between Western and indigenous concept uh, and moral concepts? How to make reparations towards non-humans. But before we go to more of those reflections, I would like to those that are not too familiar with this concept in the indigenous concept of seeing things about regarding life and territory. So I want to share a small story that is written. It's written by Eduardo Galeano. There was a team of movie directors in a community in Bolivia. So it was a small a small girl that was fascinated by the blue-eyed man that was recording. So she asked him, "So, what color do you see the world as with your eyes?" And he said, "The same color as you." She said, and the indigenous girl goes like, "But how do you know? How are you certain? How I see the world with through my eyes?" And I think one of the highest contributions that helps us in what we're trying to do, and to tell the difference, to understand that there's different ways of seeing the world and to see, life around us. And nowadays it's discussed at an international level a lot more within the process of armed conflicts and traditional justice. We're talking more about like destruction of the environment, of nature, but as Belkis mentioned already, those are just concepts that are created from a judicial system that is Eurocentric, that is very far from the thinking and practices that indigenous people live under. So, that's what we try to create an entity where indigenous lands are an integral part of this conversation. So we also want to explain for those that are not very familiar with the indigenous practices. Me as an anthropologist, European, white, it has taken me many years to begin to understand this through very deep relationships within this work. And I finally began to being able to tell what the Belkis told us. So one of the things I've learned throughout this process for my years of doing this, from the victims and the survivors of the genocide in Guatemala in the last 50 years, is that the concept of rape, that is or violation, it doesn't exist within the language. We're talking about it, and they're very monolingual. including Maya Quiches. So when you do an interlinguistic investigation, through that I understand that violation of or mushuk is must it goes far beyond what it applies to humans for us Western folks. She's so this lady told me has this rape or this violation been has been practiced towards mountains, towards other things within the land, because they consider it as a violation anything that's done against any living creature or anything that is part of uh, the environment. So when we're talking about the impact of the armed conflict, which within legal jurisprudence is called violations, within the native concept of a violation, they have a much deeper understanding and scope of what constitutes violation. For like the mountains, the corn, for instance, they're sacred and they have a whole ritual that goes around it. Because according to Popol Vuh, they are all women, men and women of the corn. That's was the origin. So for them, every single plant of corn is not just a plant; it's an entity. So anything done against it is a violation against them. And so for them, the essence of the original corn was a violation, and the corn cried and suffered just like mountains suffer. The bombings, the attacks by the army, and the burnings and all that. So we began reflecting why this is so complex within the legal world, eh, and like the Western, legal justice. So we're trying to have it recognized because we need to recognize that the uh, the the legal system is still a colonial system. So we have some certain indigenous investigators have some talks that helps us understand all the impact that the colonial system had upon their world. For instance, uh, Linda Smith says that the colonial process implied there's like the position in like in a superior place where the Western concepts were superior to everything else, just like Velkis mentioned. For us, the knowledge, the land is a resource, is a property, it's a commodity that needs to be exploited, or, quote unquote. Uh, as opposed to what that that Pedro Garzon says that despite that at international level, there's very important advances in recognizing the collective rights and the rights of indigenous folks. Between them, the right to their ancestral lands and its resources. He points out that despite all those advances, lawyers, those same lawyers themselves, they continue practicing a very interesting concept of rights and individualism that permeates everything they do. So when they apply these rights to indigenous folks, so they apply within a very Western concept of things. So when we have debates about the judicial pluralism, this comes into place where indigenous traditions and customs come into clash with Eurocentric concepts of the same things. Now, going back a little bit to what my colleague mentioned earlier, that's what we had to, when we point out that it's important to recognize this indigenous ways of seeing the world. when there's if there's gonna be a juridic recognizing of indigenous people, their lands and their territories, you have to understand that uh, so as an academic, I think the responsibility also the to reinforce the voices of these indigenous investigators that are at the forefront of this new conversation. So, for instance, the Canadian anthropologist Soto says that to recognize the territory as a living entity is a clear place of where the legal jurisprudence has to change. That the only way that can a narrative that can centralize the land as an entity, where they have the same rights as the indigenous folks themselves. And and as Tuhiwai Smith said, um, when we point out the indigenous, we were forced for many centuries to think of land and individuals as something that has property and had to be in a very individualistic way of seeing things. Now, this is something that comes out when it comes to the to the legal, quote unquote, uh, 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 tradition nowadays of things. Many countries are recognizing the rights of rivers. For instance, Bolivia and Ecuador have recognized Mother Nature as an individual with rights since 2008, 2009, I believe. We don't have enough time to go through all of that, but we can point out that we can ask out up to which point we can have nature, whether they go against or on behalf of all those indigenous groups that were recognized by international law. And my colleague Belkis also mentioned us the type of practices where the interdependence and indigenous in disability is. But now when it comes to practice, well, it's not quite there yet. Like for instance, that quote that we were talking about corn, they believe that corn cried when all these crimes were committed against it. But they mentioned that rivers can be angry too for things that are done against them. Mountains can be angry as well for the things that happen to them. And they're because they're part of this live territory, this live entity. So that creates a lot of questions within our Western just legal framework. So, and that's what we need to recognize indigenous ways of seeing the world as an integral part for moving forward. Now, one of for closing, one of the big questions that we still have is how can the territory living being victim of the armed conflict talk? Now, uh, Steve Acknos mentioned back in 1988 some of these things. She, uh, she recognized in a very famous publication that says that to to how far can we have a dialogue where the with this entity is being listened to, in this case what we call nature. So I'm pretty sure that Belkis can explain much clearly. Many of the knowledge about the damage done against the territory comes through through fire within a traditional indigenous ceremony, or the singing of birds can tell you certain things. So we ask ourselves, how far can we go in our knowledge as a Western folks and with a legal frame, Western legal frame of things. So we ask ourselves, how far can we go when it comes to recognizing this dialogue of nature on our behalf. Uh, the Guatemalan Maria Jacinta Shonkiak says that so she questions, so who defines what are the subdivisions within them? In order to understand that, we had to create this isometric world where all these voices have a place. Now, final reflections. Well, one of this is like, how far are we going towards recognizing territory as an entity, as a victim of the conflict? Is it possible that we open a much wider way towards a transitional justice and transformative? I think this call to recognize from a judicial point of view, uh, if we want to implement transitional justice, so we need to have that cultural dialogue. We have that legal dialogue. This is an invitation for all of us that were formed within a Eurocentric judicial and academic world. Within this like Western scientific rationalism that sometimes clashes with the indigenous things, where there's only one world. So these things ask us to question ourselves and how we clash, and we can help towards creating a much bigger and safer and fairer world. So in closing, I want to finish with a part of a poem, Humberto Cabal, which is a Mayan Quiche Guatemalan poem. Um, it's called Walking in Reverse. And within this framework of what's happening in Colombia, it's important that every now and then, I think it's important to remember that colonialism that is still alive and kicking in the region, as at the forefront of violation of human rights. So if we dare to look forward and the legal horizons, this is how we end up with this. So that is my contribution. Thank you very much.
Voy a empezar. El primero es, antes de todo, de reconocer y agradecer la importancia y usted piensan que esta posibilidad que has hablado pueden introducirse en los
Could be
procesos
introduced with
del occidente.
but I believe that that kind of exercise of dialogue, uh, we have tried to maintain it. We think that it's only through that horizontal relationships that we begin to create things in a collective way. In a collective way, this the Colombian process, us as a spokesperson, it's important to incorporate the knowledge of the legal system, indigenous legal system, I think it's important to expand the digital world, because there's some principles that I recognize. So people say, I recognize you and I respect you, but that's the end of it. How we can have a more horizontal way where we ended up truly defending the right to life of all these different entities. And when we learn different ways, the traditional ways, indigenous ways, things, but also to de-educate from the Western concepts that are being so damaged into our way of thinking. But we cannot have both ways. When we're done, okay, so this is legal, these are the processes, and this is constitutional. But the problem is that the breakers, the biggest framework right now within that in Colombia, what we have tried to, we can incorporating certain things, and also a chapter where internal uh, ruling, where it's important to create mechanisms where we sit down to between a traditional judge and an indigenous judge. So you must learn all these things and begin incorporating and acknowledging that there's different ways of seeing things, different ways of an- of of you know creating justice and law, or even a judicial system. So I feel like okay, so we were talking about ethno education, or this education for the indigenous people. No, I think we had to think that create a society where, with the existing diversity, where the knowledge is as important, not just for the peoples that are being left behind, but also for everyone else as part of that society. So there's still a lot to contribute on, and that transitional justice in Colombia, unfortunately, has a is having a closer relationship with the authorities, with the local authorities and indigenous authorities in Afro-Colombian, and that's the only thing that has allowed to have a closer knowledge of what happened within the armed conflict days. We try to eliminate this thing where the judge right up on top investigate, and that's it. But we believe that it's important to have that dialogue with the victims, with the perpetrators, with everyone else, where we, because we reject that idea where like the victims that live over there in the forest or in the wild, where they don't have a knowledge and they have a right to have a legal voice, they think. No, we want to tell them that they're at the center of this forum, of this conversation, which is the like, defense of these different ways of living, and the defense of the territory. This internal vision, we need to we need to continue reinforcing that, because it's how is it possible that the people can permanently remain physical, cultural, and culturally remain in different countries. On the one hand, you can, well, you need to reinforce that identity, their rights and everything. So that basically means that we need to expand the world where, in order for past to exist, everyone live in harmony and with the equal rights, where everyone has an equal part in things. So, better happen. I'm very thankful to have this space, because I think it's an opportunity to continue uh, listening to this vision. When it comes to how we see life. So there's a couple different questions within the forum. There are people in Colombia that wants to know if Balk's expectations of from the Commission of Truth if she hopes that they're gonna recognize the rise of the territories and the rivers. On the other hand, there's another type of questions of people that are more interested in knowing if both of you have thought in the have thought to talk about ecocide, like or crimes against the nature, or the things like another violation is the mega projects that take place often in native territories. So there's two different types of pregnancy, but you can choose which one you want to answer to. Well, the most difficult questions, I'm gonna leave it to Lisala. so, so someone from the convention, well, regarding the convention, well, the integral system of enabling justice, well, I hope they advance toward it clarifying the truth within the Colombian armed conflict. So this has to only happen when the three bodies are part of this group. However, the racial council of things had a previous conversation, and where we saw that the only way for this to move forward to have an articulated and coordinated conversation where each mechanism, instead of having each mechanism have a separate conversation. So I think the commission of truth, I think the truth has to be an integral part of the liberating way of how we can move forward and restore what was before. I hope that answered the question. So I want to have try to answer the question about ecocide and the conversations I've had with uh, with Velkes. Well, it's very clear what has happened in Colombia as well as Guatemala, because in Guatemala the great majority of the population is indigenous. So all that armed conflict, pretty much all the armed conflict was in native territory. In Colombia, the diversity is a little bigger, and and in the rural areas, it was like farmers, it was indigenous people, and there was Afro-Colombians, and many times the victims that were of mixed origins. So effectively, the idea of enabling the conflict to have the right to be considered a victim and seeing from their own perspective of the victims and Afro-descendant uh, participants as well as indigenous. And I'm pretty sure they're gonna have they're trying to have a more integral relationship with rivers, and other things. But it's never going to be quite the same as the concept that indigenous folks have regarding the land as an entity and a full entity. So when like the judicial bodies talk about like the damage to the environment and to the land, etc., the concept like ecocide and other things uh, it start to having a bigger place, even in international arenas. That the concept of ecocide is taking more better foothold, and the aerospace concept of a property and rights is starting to change. Where as you know, the Eurocentric concept was like everything within our planet was subject to property and to exploitation. So I think it's important to continue have this dialogue, to continue reflecting on how things apply to each other. So would that be perceived as an ecocide? Well, this is still to be resolved, and in the meanwhile we had to do our part in order to make that a reality, and that we had to add the experiences. and and try to understand that the experiences are different. The experiences and colonization in Asia and Africa are very different to what happens say in Colombia, Guatemala, and Peru, for instance. So Belkis already explained the difference with what means territory between even the natives right there in Colombia. And there's a very difference within the indigenous, what land means within the indigenous people in Guatemala as well. Just like there's also diverse systems of justice within the indigenous world. That's just a couple of reflections regarding the question regarding what we, in the Western world we call the environment and the concept of ecocide. So we run out of time. So I want to start thanking Lizolet and Belkis for not just the time that they gave us today, but also the trajectory they are developing. I believe that they're the wide recognizing of people that think very much that you opened up this space, but also the challenge where there's more questions than answers to be tackled. But the challenge of going backwards is very attractive. It's, it's, it's it's not exactly a choice for us that are already on this path, and the possibility to create something new uh, while we understand how to just listen and to listen in depth. So again, thank you very much for your time, for everything you all have done, and for all your work and your effort. Thank you so very much for everything.